Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our very exciting talk this evening. Few parish notices first. There always has to be, doesn't there? So first of all, I hope you've all had an opportunity to go and have a look at the open exhibition, which is extremely popular and works are selling incredibly quickly. So get over there quick. There might be nothing left by the time you look. And as you will know, we're running the St Barbe Open Gardens again this year on the 29th of May. We have ticket booklets for sale, which will be for sale after this evening's talk if you wanted to purchase some. And also, being the organisation that we are, we're always a little short on help and volunteers from time to time. And we're looking for 3 people to help with the town centre plant sale on the 29th of May from 2 until 6. So if you're able to help at all, if you could speak to somebody on your way out, or speak to Jackie who's waving at the back there, look. Speak to Jackie. She'd be very grateful to hear from you. So, welcome everyone to this talk this evening by Mr. David Moore-Gwyn. David joined Sothebys in 1976 and had 36 years in the art world, which has given him a unique experience of working in auction houses. He started out as a chancery barrister in London, but quickly moved into the art world, which I think was probably a very good move. He's had a long and very successful career, and we very much look forward to hearing about it tonight. So I'd like to introduce you to Mr. David Moore-Gwyn. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Good evening, everybody. My erstwhile colleague at Sothebys, James Sturton, told me a story of when long ago he attended the 70th birthday party of the distinguished artist John Piper. Piper's wife ended her brilliant speech with the following words: "I've been married to John for 50 years and I have loved every other minute of it." Well, I have only done 40 years at Sotheby's, actually, as I joined in 1976 and retired in 2015. But I think that I can say the same about my time at Sotheby's. Now, my intention this evening is to give some background of the rise of Sotheby's and then add some personal reminiscences of various highlights that I've experienced and a few of the dramas that I've encountered. Here is the front of Sotheby's in Bond Street. Note the Egyptian figure above the door, because we'll come back to that a little later. Now, Sotheby's was founded in 1744, over 20 years earlier than its great rival Christie's. There are, however, 2 facts about the firm that many people do not know. Firstly, the founder of Sotheby's was not a Mr. Sotheby, but Samuel Baker. And secondly, when it was founded, it was a book saleroom. And here you can see a book sale going on in the early 18th century. The founder was Samuel Baker, shown here in a portrait by Charles Grignon, still owned by Sotheby's. He was a bookseller by trade, and the first catalogue of his which survives is from February 1734, but we can tell at once from this that he wasn't yet an auctioneer. He lists all the books to be offered and then adds the words, "which will be sold cheap," which is not a very good slogan for an auctioneer. In March 1744, Baker was given the chance to sell the library of Sir John Stanley, and in order to do this, he leased a room at the top of Exeter Exchange in the Strand and sold the library by auction. The sale was a great success, and a lot of other sales followed, and by the 1750s, he had his own premises at York Street in Covent Garden and took on 2 partners, George Lee and John Sotheby, his nephew. And on Baker's death, his share passed to John Sotheby, and the Sotheby name continued to be associated with the firm until 1861. The dramatist Charles Dibdin described Baker as a hale, healthy, joyous fellow, and he was well liked by the book trade. But if we travel to Pall Mall, we meet James Christie, who had set up business in 1766 and was clearly a very different character. I'm sorry about the poor quality of the image. This is actually a wonderful portrait by Gainsborough. He rubbed shoulders with the likes of Garrick, Johnson, Burke and Sheridan, and you can see from this portrait that he fancied himself as a gentleman. His auctions were glamorous events with many royal clients, and sales were often by invitation only. There is absolutely no question that until the 20th century, Christie's was the dominant firm in all areas except for books. So when in 1848 the great sale was held at Stowe, Christie's were responsible for the 40-day sale, while Sothebys contented themselves with the books. And the same applies to the great Hamilton Palace sale, which took place in 1882. Sotheby's did, however, diversify. They sold coins, medals, prints and drawings, and most notably they sold the estate of the great artist Richard Parkes Bonington. But when Sir Thomas Lawrence died the next year, his estate was sold at Christie's. In 1835, Sotheby's held a 9-day sale of antiquities collected by Henry Salt, who had been Consul General in Egypt. He was one of the many who benefited from Napoleon's encouragement of excavations in Egypt, and a lot of his collection is now in the British Museum. Among the items in Salt's sale was a bust of the severe Egyptian lion goddess Sekhmet. The bust was unsold, and Sotheby's acquired it and placed it over the entrance of their premises, which was then in Wellington Street. And when the firm moved to Bond Street in 1917, Sekhmet came to and remains there until this day. And you can see Sekhmet in the first slide this evening. Now, the low point in Sotheby's history was reached in 1907. After the death of the last member of the Sotheby family, the firm was run by John Wilkinson and his partner, Edward Hodge, who eventually took over and passed the firm to his son Tom, who needed to take out some capital and was trying to sell it to a lot of booksellers. He found one who were interested at the sum of £30,000, but fortunately negotiations faltered and Hodge was desperate. Whilst he was in Devon, he met Montague Barlow, and Montague Barlow was promised to help find a buyer. Barlow reported back that he'd found 2 investors who might buy the firm: Felix Ware, a banker's son of the headmaster of Eton, and Geoffrey Hobson, a brilliant classical scholar and linguist, who passed the Foreign Office exam with distinction. Who was the third then? Hodge said. Well, I'll put myself forward, said Montague Barlow. Now, Montague Barlow doesn't look from this photograph as to be a likely figure to be responsible for the resurgence of Sotheby's, but in fact, he was what he achieved was very remarkable throughout the whole period of the First World War and afterwards. After getting a first-in-law at Cambridge, he became a barrister, entered Parliament, became a minister, and was made a baronet. He was a brilliant organiser with an ability to think outside the box. Under Hodge, the firm was very much wedded to the 19th century. There were no telephones, no typewriters, but instead they had written ledgers. The post was looked at, and if an inquiry was not of interest, the letter was just thrown in the waste paper basket. And of course, no women were employed. Barlow livened things up. He encouraged advertising. He rang the editors of newspapers. He greatly increased the numbers of illustrations. He was lucky to preside over some very great sales before the First World War, notably the spectacular sale of Robert Browning's letters to Elizabeth Barrett, and also the private sale of the library at Chatsworth to the Huntington Museum. The day, the 20th of June 1913, was rather a watershed for Sotheby's. Lord Glen Usk had decided to sell a Shakespeare First Folio, and he dropped off at the same time a portrait by the great Dutch painter Frans Hals. He had bought it back in 1884 for 5 guineas, and Sotheby's decided that they might as well put it in a sale. So they put it in a mixed sale, and it made £9,000, which in those days was an enormous price. It was a higher price than either of the other 2 Frans Hals paintings on offer from Christie's. and this encouraged Barlow to begin to think that he might compete with Christie's in the field of pictures. But two things stood in his way. Firstly, the lack of expertise. They had no really expertise at all on selling paintings. And of course, the First World War, which greatly disrupted sales. Many of the leading people in the firm were called away, and the great decision was made to bring in women, but under strict instructions that they should wear dark blue overalls so that they were inconspicuous. In 1916, Barlow employed Elizabeth Sotheby, a Girton graduate, who had worked with a celebrated antiquarian bookseller. She later recalled, his great concern was that any women employed by the firm should look as unattractive to the male as possible. He reminded me that numbers of men came into the saleroom, and it was most important that their attention should not be distracted by elegant females. Barlow was keen to improve conditions for his staff. He brought in typewriters, he brought in paid holidays, tea ladies, and even for a few years, profit sharing. He also presided over the move from Wellington Street, where the traffic used to roar past over Waterloo Bridge. Here you can see an old print. And he found a premises in the West End in Bond Street. It was an old inn called the Black Horse Inn, with underground storage rooms for wine. And they're still there. When I joined Sothebys, you can see under the ground where the wine was stored, and a drive-in for the wine merchants' vans. So the final sale was held at Wellington Street on the 25th of May, 1917. And the great advantage of the move to Bond Street was the neighbours. Number 33 was Madame Elsie, court milliner. Number 36 was Madame Henry, court dressmaker. And dealers like Agnew's and Colnagi's were not far away. At its grand opening, Queen Mary attended, and Miss Sotheby recalled that she was allowed to wear her best Paris dress and discard her overalls. Queen Mary became a very keen visitor to Sotheby's, and if you find an old catalogue with the name Dawson, this was the name she used, a pseudonym, when she was buying. The immediate post-war years were very good for Sotheby's. The great Pointer collection of drawings emphasised the need for expertise, and experts were brought in, firstly Charles Bell from the Ashmolean Museum, and then an eccentric Finnish expert, Tancred Borenius, who was very well connected and knew a lot about Italian paintings. In 1927, Sotheby's sold the library at Britwell Court for the Christie Miller family for £600,000, more than any library had ever fetched. And at this stage, I want to bring in the tale of the tortoise and the hare. For the whole of the 19th century, Christie had regarded Sotheby's as a saleroom to whom they passed books and miscellaneous items. But gradually, like the tortoise, Sotheby's were catching up. And in the years 1929 to 30, the year of the Wall Street crash, Sotheby's profits were £39,000, Christie's were £29,000. And Sotheby's continued to show a profit for the next few years, whilst Christie's showed a loss. And in 1933, an extraordinary thing happened. Lancelot Hannon, chairman of Christie's, approached Sotheby's regarding amalgamation. And there were some very serious negotiations. And if you know about the subsequent history of collusion and that sort of thing between Sotheby's and Christie's, it's astonishing to think that in 1933 and two subsequent occasions, Christie's actually approached Sotheby's regarding amalgamation. It came to nothing, but Sotheby's continued to expand in the 1930s in two particular directions. There was a lot of travel to the continent, where Geoffrey Hobson in particular forged some valuable links with Jewish collectors. And then there were country house sales, notably Hartwell and Tythrop, two of Lord Cowdrey's houses, and in 1937, the great four-day sale at the Rothschild House at 148 Piccadilly, covered by the BBC. Now, 1937 was a very important year, because now we enter what I should call the Peter Wilson years. This was the date when Peter Wilson was first employed. And Peter Wilson is a very remarkable figure. He was responsible for the preeminent position that Sothebys held, and really for the success of the whole art world. He had an enormous, wide knowledge. He could go into a house and he could look at a bit of porcelain and then suddenly say, and I think that drawing might be by Rubens. He had a great eye for almost anything that anyone could collect, and he was one of the great auctioneers. His father, Sir Matthew Scatters Wilson, was so called because of his inability to keep money, and the family had no real base. Wilson hated Eton and left New College after 1 year. There's rather a sad quote from later in life. He said, "I think a very happy childhood is not conducive to success in later life." A very sad thing to say. He went abroad to learn French and German, and his talented mother approached Sotheby's to see if they could give his son a job. He became a junior catalogue in the furniture department and was at once given an amazing collection of 2,000 rings from a man called Monsieur de Gilou. They dated from ancient Egypt to the time of Napoleon. And I think that the directors had expected him just to list the rings with maybe whether they were diamond or ruby. Instead, he did a lot of work, produced a very scholarly catalogue, and he was soon made a partner. In the war, he was in intelligence, where his paths crossed with Philby and Maclean, and a lot of people have asked since, could he have been the fifth man? I think this is impossible, in fact, because he was incredibly indiscreet and would have been a very unsatisfactory fifth man. After the war, Wilson worked hard to get new experts, and he managed to get Hans and Carmen Gronau, two notable Old Master experts. And then we reach the Farouk sale, and this isn't a member of Sotheby's staff. This is King Farouk of Egypt, who was a remarkable man. He was, as you can see, extravagant, obese, with numerous mistresses and a mania for collecting. And he was finally ousted in 1951 by Colonel Nasser. The rumour then was that there would be a big sale, and Peter Wilson went out to Egypt, fought hard, and managed to get the sale for Sotheby's. In the end, they made no money at all because of the costs and the fact that the new government were rather unwilling to pay commission. But the great thing was the publicity put Sotheby's on the map. And now we come to 4 particular sales which cemented Sotheby's position as a leading auction house. The first was in 1956, when Sotheby's offered a very important picture of the Adoration of the Shepherds by Poussin, which came from a certain Commander Beauchamp in Norfolk. Such was the excitement caused by this picture that the owner received a series of private offers. Now, what actually happens in these circumstances nowadays is that the auction house agrees to guarantee a reserve to dissuade you from accepting a private offer. But in those days, guarantees didn't exist, but Peter Wilson was always one to push the boundaries further. And so he said, I will guarantee this picture for £15,000, which is an enormous amount of money at that date. However, that was not enough. Still more offers came in, and finally he was forced to go to £35,000. The picture in the end sold for £29,000, which was an enormous price, but of course it did cost the firm quite a lot of money. But again, the publicity of Sotheby's selling a very major Old Master painting was colossal. You've got to remember that great Old Master paintings in the 1930s were really sold by great dealers like Duveen. And one of Peter Wilson's great successes was to break into that and to persuade people that actually Sotheby's were the place to sell great paintings. The next great sale was the collection belonging to the German financier Wilhelm Weinberg, who had settled in Holland before the war, but was on a business trip in Paris when the Germans moved in and was able to get his family out. He moved to New York, and his 56 pictures included 10 by Van Gogh. The sale had colossal publicity. The great firm of J. Walter Thompson was brought in, and part of J. Walter Thompson's job was to ensure that everybody knew about the sale. When the partners saw the list with The Queen written down, they assumed that this was the Queen magazine. In fact, it was the Queen at Buckingham Palace who was sent an invitation. She attended, and the rumour is that she was very keen to buy a beautiful Degas called At the Races. It isn't in the Royal Collection, so one can only assume she was unsuccessful. This was the first specialist sale of Impressionist paintings, and there was enormous TV and radio coverage, and even a photograph in the Financial Times. The total of 326,000 for the whole sale was considered astonishing, and there was much critical comment. In the Evening Standard, Quentin Crewe said that the prices won't last, they were ridiculous. And in the House of Lords, when they were debating whether to stop some of these great pictures going abroad, their lordships said, well, all we have to do is wait for the market to fall, because these high prices will never last. Well, as you know, they got it very badly wrong. This rather beautiful Renoir sold for £22,000, and there was a Van Gogh that sold for £31,000. Now, the next sale was the greatest of all Peter Wilson's triumphs. This was in 1958, when the collection of the banker Jacob Goldschmidt was offered for sale. Jacob Goldschmidt had been an important dealer in Germany, again a collector in Germany before the war, and he'd actually come across Sothebys. He'd come into Sothebys having contacted one of the directors and said, now what is the best commission you can give me if I sell my jewels through you? And they said, no, this is what the commission is. So he went down the road to Christie's and sold his jewellery at Christie's. So when this sale came up, his son, who by then was dealing with it, had decided that he was going to set Sotheby's and Christie's against each other. And what happened was they took rooms in the Savoy and produced 14 pictures to test the two firms. They were in two separate rooms. And there's a nice story that Carmen Gronow, who was the head of Old Masters, heard Goldsmith say, "Die hier gefallen mir viel besser," which I believe means, I like this lot a lot more. And she then realized that in the next door room was Christie's. The prize was 7 sensational Impressionists. And there is Peter Wilson taking the sale, the great Goldsmith sale. There already had been an offer of £600,000 for the collection. And Peter Wilson agreed that they would earn nothing at all unless the total of the sale was over 700,000. He organised an evening sale as a black tie event. He rang Lord Beaverbrook to ensure maximum press coverage, and there were crowds outside Bond Street. The sale of the 7 pictures took only 21 minutes, and when the beautiful Cézanne, shown here, and there is a close-up, when the beautiful Cézanne of the Garçon aux Gilets Rouges sold for £220,000, the highest price ever paid for a modern picture, Peter Wilson looked round and said, "What? Will no one offer any more?" The identity of the buyer was not disclosed, but John Carter, who was Sotheby's man in America, had an idea that it was the great collector Paul Mellon. And when he met him a few weeks after the sale, he got him to admit that he was the buyer. "Did I pay too much?" said Paul Mellon, and then added, "You stand in front of a picture like that, and what is money?" Now that's the sort of client, of course, that auctioneers want. The final great sale of this period was the Great Adoration of the Magi by Rubens, sold from Eaton Hall by the Duke of Westminster to look after the colossal death duties of £17 million after the death of the second Duke of Westminster. It was larger than any picture ever offered, and we had to get it into the saleroom somehow. It was nearly 13 foot high, and we had to break down some walls to get it in. It was brought in overnight, and the whole thing was watched by journalists from the Daily Express. And when he was asked, what are you doing, why are you wanting to watch all this, he said, I'm rather hoping that you drop the picture and then I'll have a good story the next day. They didn't drop the picture, but it had an enormous reserve of £200,000. The National Gallery said they were interested, but gave a derisory offer, and in the event it sold for £275,000. There were 5 bidders at over £100,000, including Paul Getty. The mystery buyer was a certain Major Allnut, who was a property man, and he'd intended to lend it and then present it to the National Gallery, but they kept turning down his calls and not turning up to meetings. And so the Rubens expert, Michael Jaffe, said, well, why don't you give it to Cambridge? And it hangs now in King's College, Cambridge, where it can be seen to this day. Now, just to put those 4 sales in perspective, between 1957 and 1977, Sotheby's turnover was on average double that of Christie's, and this was Peter Wilson's great achievement, and I think those 4 sales very much contributed. The next great move of Peter Wilson was the acquisition of Park Burnett in New York. He had tried back in 1947, but instead he appointed a very effective book expert, John Carter, who travelled around the USA giving talks. Sotheby's were able to offer more attractive terms, and by 1957, 1/5 of Sotheby's turnover came from New York. Park Burnett was a very effective firm. They had been founded as a breakaway from the American Art Association, and in 1961 they sold a great Rembrandt for over £2 million. However, they had a terrible deal with their landlord at 980 Madison Avenue, which is what this is. And every time they made a great sale, they had to pay quite a big percentage to the landlord. Peregrine Pollen was sent over by Peter Wilson to prepare the ground. He won a great sale, the Freiburg sale, against great competition. This was the first time we had a full colour dust jacket to the catalogue. And then in September 1963, Leslie Hyam, the boss of Park Burnett, unexpectedly died. Sotheby's made their move against great national opposition. There was a great feeling that England was buying part of America's heritage. The opposite, usually what we're talking about, Americans buying our heritage. But in those days, Park Burnett was an important part of American heritage. A certain Colonel Gimble, who was quite a big shareholder, held out, but finally they succumbed. And Sotheby's were able to introduce reserves, which they weren't able to do before, and a better commission rates. And they held the world's first sale of contemporary art in Madison Avenue. And for quite a few years, Christie's didn't follow suit. These were heady times for Sotheby's. They acquired Borlée for packing and storage of paintings, Patrickson for frames, and offices were open in Edinburgh, Paris, Australia, Italy, and Sotheby's Belgravia was open for Victorian art. And then came one of those downturns which we've all got used to, and by 1974 we had double-digit inflation. Sotheby's did not watch their soaring overheads. The mantra was that all that you needed to do was secure the business. What about the shipping costs, you might ask, the insurance costs, the costs if the reserve wasn't met? These things were not taken account of. Peter Wilson called in Peter Spara from Warburg's, and he had to make some unpopular decisions. This was a time when the buyer's premium was introduced, causing a lot of trade boycotts. And we now come to the year 1976, and I'm going to digress briefly, because this is the year that I joined Sotheby's. I was having dinner with Andrew Festing, who is now a portrait painter and was then a director of Sotheby's, and I said to him how much I envied his job and how much I was fed up with the law. He said, well, if you're serious, come for an interview, there's a vacancy. And I was interviewed by the great Peregrine Pollen, who we've talked about, and I was offered a job in what was called modern pictures. Modern pictures meant anything that wasn't an old master and wasn't an impressionist. Now, the office was underground, there was no light, there were no computers, so if a picture came in, you had a card index. If the card index was misfiled, the picture was lost. There were piles of pictures at the bottom of the stairs in stacks. And actually the underground was very good in 1976, being underground, because there was a great heat wave. You had to go upstairs to the valuations counter. And because I knew almost nothing about pictures in those days, the great thing was I would say, we've got to look at the picture under better light. Can I take it away? Or better light, of course, involved going down to the basement where there was no light. But I was able at least to say to my colleagues, what exactly is this? It is extraordinary, the lack of computers and the fact that even until about 10 years ago, pictures turned up that were misfiled and, there were no trace. And I wrote to a very distinguished collector and said, you might be interested in this picture because it's one of your ancestors. And he said, I'm very interested. It came to Sothebys in 1975, and I haven't seen it since. So there is some advantage in computers. And I also arrived at the time of a man called Tom Keating, which you may have heard of, who was the great faker of the great visionary painter and friend of Blake, Samuel Palmer. And I remember there were a lot of meetings going on and a lot of correspondence in the papers about the effect of all these fakes. One particular thing I remember in the basement was a visit of Princess Margaret. Andrew Festing was very nervous about this because he'd heard that Princess Margaret was particularly keen on modern paintings, and this really wasn't his area. She walked round and she turned to him and said, do you get air down here? And he said, air, wait a minute, thinking this must be some obscure Scottish painting he hadn't heard of. She was not amused by this. Air, she said, A-I-R. Now, I need the next. No, there. The first exciting event of my time was the sale at Mentmore. This is the great Victorian house built by Joseph Paxton for Baron Meyer de Rothschild, whose daughter Hannah married the 5th Earl of Rosebery. In 1974, the 6th Earl died and left death duties of £4.5 million. Many attempts were made to negotiate with the government. Letters were written to the Times, but you've got to remember that 1977 was a time of great austerity, the time of the Callaghan government, and they decided that politically to produce £3.5 million for a large collection in a large Victorian house was politically impossible. So the sale went ahead. It was Sotheby's at its very best. Large parts of the house were not lived in and were permanently shuttered. 11,000 catalogues were produced. They actually ran out of catalogues and they became quite valuable. I've got a set, and I think there is a certain value in them now. There was a large marquee, worldwide press. I remember very well the start of the sale, with Lord Rosebery himself taking 25 minutes to fix the microphone. He was very good at that sort of thing, rather better, I think, than we were. The sale totaled over £6 million, and many of the great lots were bought by museums. But astonishing prices were made for coat hangers, water jugs, laundry baskets. It was the first sale where they sold absolutely everything, and you didn't have to be rich to come along. You could buy a souvenir of a great house. The second great sale of my early times was very different, but the final total was much greater. It was the collection of Robert von Hirsch, who had collected since 1905 and died aged 94 in 1966. He collected the very greatest medieval and Renaissance works of art. This is a Byzantine ivory relief of Christ, probably from Constantinople, from the 11th century. It's only 9 inches high, but made £630,000. He had wanted to leave the collection to museums, but he was thrown out of Germany by the Nazis, and this rather discouraged him. He'd had an offer, the executors had an offer of £4 million for the collection, but it was turned down. And this was the first time, in my memory certainly, that highlights were sent around the world. They were sent to Frankfurt, to Zurich, to the Royal Academy, and the publicity was enormous. It was actually quite a Catholic collection. He had Van Gogh, Cézanne, Rembrandt, Dürer, as well as great works of art. It was such an important sale that 12 museums in Germany got together, went to the government and said, you've got to buy the following 10 lots. And the sale was a massive success. It made over £18 million. Hirsch had been a very interesting client of Sotheby's because he was constantly querying the valuations, not saying they were too low, but saying they were too high. And there was a particular enamel medallion which we'd valued at £30,000, which he said was absurd, far too high. In the event, in the sale, it made £1.2 million. Now, it seemed as if good times would go on forever, but there was again a change in the market. And if you think of market share, in 1977, Sotheby's was 67%, Christie's 33%. By 1982, Sotheby's were 54% and Christie's 46%. Peter Wilson had retired and handed over to David Westmoreland. The share price had fallen, there were redundancies, and Sotheby's were very vulnerable. And this was the time when Sotheby's was approached by two businessmen, Marshall Cogan and Stephen Swid, owners of Knoll and General Felt Industries. There was great alarm, I remember, at Sotheby's. There were meetings. Graham Llewellyn, who was then the chief executive, said to the national press that he would blow his brains out if Cogan and Swid were successful. Now, you're not meant to say that sort of thing when you're head of a company. And I remember there was a tremendous consternation, and we were all told that we had to refuse to work for them. The whole matter went to the Monopolies Commission, and I think the takeover very nearly happened. But very luckily, a white knight was found, Alfred Taubman, who had built up a fortune in retail and virtually invented the shopping mall. By the late 1970s, he owned 20 shopping malls, including one outside Chicago, reckoned to be the biggest in the world. In 1977, he did a colossal realty deal in California with a group of friends, including Henry Ford, and sold out in 1983 for a profit of $1 billion. So he had money to spend. He was also a keen collector. And a friend of his, David Metcalf, tipped off David Westmoreland and said, I think this could be a man to save the day. He didn't need to borrow, unlike Cogan and Swid. And there was what was the great word being used then was synergy. There was reckoned to be a chemistry with him. He was successful. He filled the board with names like Baron Thiessen, Henry Ford, the Infanta of Spain, and someone called Earl Smith. It took us a bit of time to work out that Earl Smith was not in Debrett's. He was actually a very rich property man in Florida. He was very smart. Within 3 months, he turned a loss of £4 million to profit. He had, of course, bought at the bottom of the cycle. He was obsessed with client services. I remember a meeting where he said, you may think that Christie's have a bad record for client services. Well, yours is even worse. Something must be done. He brought in a lot of glamorous advisory girls to form a client advisory department. One of his first sales was the Gould sale. Sorry about the quality of this. Mrs. Gould had sold her jewellery at Christie's. Well, during all that business with the takeover, a lot of people were put off selling at Sotheby's. But one of the last things Peter Wilson did before he died was to work on her, to persuade her to sell her Impressionists at Sotheby's. And her sale was a great success. And her lovely Van Gogh, which is showing here, made $9 million, the highest price yet achieved in America. It was bought by a lady called Mrs. Fortebat from Argentina. And I'm going to use this as an excuse to digress and to discuss 4 major British pictures for which I had the good fortune to be involved and catalogue. And the reason for this is that Mrs. Fortebat was also the buyer of this great Turner. This great Turner we sold in 1980 for just over $6 million, and it was a record for any painting for a short time. The reason it was so exciting was because it had been unknown since the late 19th century when it was last exhibited. Turner had exhibited it in 1836 and had had quite a lot of bad press. So much so that Ruskin wrote a very famous defense of Turner. This picture was owned by Turner's great patron, Monroe of Navarre, and was sold by the great American philanthropist and collector, Flora Whitney Miller, to benefit her museum. The second great picture that I was lucky enough to be involved in is also by Turner. And this we sold in 1994 for a record price of just over £7 million. That was a record price in those days for any picture. It belonged to the celebrated art historian Kenneth Clark, at one time head of the National Gallery, but now best known for his television series Civilization. He was walking past Agnew's window on his way back from lunch one day in 1951 and bought it for £2,000. So from £2,000 to just over 7 million, it was a pretty good investment. This is one of the most wonderful pictures, in my opinion, that we've sold at Sothebys. It's one of those late paintings that remained in his studio. We don't know exactly how it left his studio, because most of them are part of the Turner bequest and are in the Tate Gallery. But some escaped. Some were given away or sold by his housekeeper, Mrs. Booth. Some, I suspect, were stolen. It is the type of picture which looks forward to the contemporary paintings which now so dominate the market. The third great picture, rather a dark image, I'm afraid, is The Lock by John Constable, one of his great 6-foot canvases. He painted these 6-foot canvases of the landscape around his birthplace in Suffolk, and all the others, which include the Hay Wain and the White Horse, are in famous public collections. It had a wonderful provenance, as it was being sold by descendants of James Morrison, the original purchaser. Despite being offered for sale in November 1990 at a very low point in the market, it fetched over £10 million. It was bought by Baron Thyssen, and it hung for many years in his museum in Madrid. I actually had to appear in front of the Export Reviewing Committee when it was going to be taken out of the country. And of course it was very difficult to argue that it wasn't an important picture, having written a catalogue saying it was the most important constable we'd ever sold. So I did try to say to the committee that one of the things they might like to consider was there are no other constables in Spain, but unfortunately that was not an allowable argument. But of course no museum came forward with the money, and it did go to Madrid. In 2012, his widow decided to sell it, and it made just over £22 million, approximately double what it made when we sold it. The fourth picture is the great portrait of Oh My by Sir Joshua Reynolds. The story of the sale of this is rather similar to the Mentmore saga. It was offered to the Tate in 2001 for £5.5 million, but they brought in experts to advise, and the expert advisor said this value is too high. Now, the previous record for Reynolds had been just over £1 million, and we were slightly sticking our neck out by saying to the owner it was going to fetch between £6 and £8 million. But sometimes you have to move into a different league when a picture is of such importance as this. As in the event, I'm glad to say, we were proved right, and the picture made just over £10 million. The reason I'm showing that is merely that before the sale, I remember having to show this to lots and lots of experts and possible buyers. And just before the sale, the night before the sale, I was called down to show it to an American Impressionist collector who had never bought anything that wasn't Impressionist in his life, but was bowled over by the picture. And he turned out to be the underbidder, so it was a worthwhile trip. It was sold to help with the upkeep of Castle Howard, where it had come from. It had originally been bought by the Earl of Carlisle just after it was painted. And we were able to help the family with a tax loophole by getting it accepted as plant. I have to say this was immediately changed, but it was very helpful for the family. It is a very great portrait of the celebrated native from Tahiti who came back to England with Captain Cook and spent 2 years in England. There were endless export problems with this picture, as the buyer was Irish. He got a temporary export license to hang it in Dublin, but now he's trying to export it. And the value which has been accepted is £50 million. You may have read that in the press about a month ago. It is very surprising when you think that we were battling back in 2001 over the difference between 5.5 and 4.5, 5.5 million, something like that, and now it's 50 million. And it's an idea, it shows you how a market can move, how the market, this is particularly at the moment, the subject matter, the quality of the picture. It's something for which there will be an enormous amount of demand if it were to come back in the open market. To return to the Taubman years, Alfred Taubman was a great believer in offering credit to encourage buyers. He used to say 60% of art collectors are American, but only 1% of American millionaires actually buy at auction. Why is this? So he offered credit to a number of buyers. Now, credit is fine when the market is booming, but things can go wrong. Alan Bond, the Australian millionaire who financed the winning boat in the America's Cup, was keen on the Van Gogh sunflowers, which were being sold by Christie's in spring 1987. And when he failed to buy that, he was even more interested when in November that year, Sothebys offered the irises. Bond bought the picture for just over $50 million, financed on the security of the picture and the rest of the collection. The problem, of course, was that when his empire collapsed, Sothebys had to take back the irises and to sell the rest of his collection. And another example of this boom period was in May 1990, when Sothebys sold the Moulin de la Galette by Renoir for $78 million. These are colossal prices, although they've been, in some cases, overtaken by some contemporary paintings. But this Renoir is still one of the highest Renoir prices. It was bought by Mr. Saito, a Japanese collector, who also went bankrupt, and this picture also came back on the market. Now, the early 1990s were a very difficult time for all the auction houses. It started with the Iran-Iraq war, and the Impressionist sales were up to 50% unsold. But then the market, as it always happens, picked up. And this was a time when there was vicious competition between Sotheby's and Christie's, with severe cutting of commission rates. In 1994, Christie's were ahead of Sotheby's for the first time for many years. And I remember D.D. Brooks, who was then our American CEO, started to talk more about profit than turnover. She used to say, you can have an enormous turnover, but it's no good if you're not making any money. And this is the background of the celebrated price-fixing scandal around 2000, which led to Alfred Taubman and Anthony Tennant being found guilty. Alfred Taubman stepped down from Sotheby's. D.D. Brooks was given house arrest, and it was a very bad time for both firms because enormous fines were given by the American legal system. We all felt very worried about the future of the company, and we felt rather let down by senior management, because all the time that we'd been battling away for property, unknown to us, members of Sotheby's and Christie's had been colluding behind our backs. However, the strength of Sotheby's lies in its experts, and thankfully, most continued to work at the job they loved. And this next image shows a great picture by Rubens. It was a great discovery made in 2001. Now, 2001 was just after Alfred Tauben had given up running Sothebys, so it was a bad time. But my colleague George Gorton saw this painting. It had belonged initially to the great Liechtenstein collection, and for many years it was considered to be a copy, or at least a work by a studio assistant. George recognized its quality, persuaded the Rubens experts to back it, and it was sold at Sotheby's in July 2002 for £49.5 million. It was bought by Lord Thompson, and it's now in the Toronto Art Gallery. This sale underlines what has happened to the art market. It is a masterpiece market. Sotheby's and Christie's now concentrate on major works of art. Areas like coins, stamps, arms and armour have been outsourced. The furniture department has fewer sales. Most furniture is now sold in provincial salerooms. Provincial salerooms have benefited enormously from this. The same applies to much of the silver and porcelain market. It's also a time when new markets, particularly in China, India and Russia, have moved demand to a completely different area. Above all, post-impressionist and contemporary art now dominates. And I'm going to give an example of this. This is a painting by Jean-Michel Basquiat, an African-American graffiti artist from the Bronx in New York, who died in 1988, aged only 27. Sotheby's sold this 1982 painting for $110 million, which puts him in the league of Picasso and Monet. The movement in the market can be seen if we realize that this picture had been bought in 1984 for $19,000. That is an increase of $5,800, from $19,000 to $110 million. An astonishing movement. An artist whose work has often hit the headlines, but not at such exalted prices, is Damien Hirst. In 2008, he became the first living artist to literally empty the contents of his studio into an auction. Despite the terrible times, the sale coincided with the day of the Lehman Brothers crash. The total was £110 million. I remember that the floors of Sotheby's had to be strengthened because of the weight of these tanks of formaldehyde into which these animals were placed. This image shows a picture by the famous and mysterious graffiti artist Banksy, one of whose pictures self-destructed just after it was auctioned. You may have read this. It was called Girl with Balloon, and as the auctioneer put down the hammer, it began to disintegrate. And this is a fuzzy photograph, but it shows the moment that the picture dissolved. Now, I remember when this happened, there was terrible consternation, particularly in our New York insurance department, because they thought, well, I think they'd never seen anything like this before. The hammer has come down, and the picture that's been sold has been destroyed, and we're going to be liable for $1.5 million, which is what it had sold for. But the end of the story is somewhat different. The lady who bought it realized that actually it was rather a sensation to own a Banksy that had been half destroyed. So in October 2021, as a partly shredded picture, it sold for $25 million. Now, it's very difficult really to understand that sort of market, and I'm not going to pretend to. I'd like to conclude by saying that we can almost sell anything now. There's a market for trainers. We sell something called an NFT, a non-fungible token. And this is a unique digital image. And I'm not going to pretend to be able to explain to you what you're buying, but it is a unique image and there is a very strong market in it. And I'm just ending here with, going back to 1995, in fact, when we sold a test specimen of the supersonic Concorde plane's nose. It was 24.5 feet long, and this shows that there's almost nothing that we won't sell. Sothebys have been very kind to me. I've enjoyed enormously working there. I've gone and travelled to great collections, and I've worked with wonderful colleagues. And despite all the curious things that now make vast sums of money, there is a backbone of great experts who love the field they work in and who still offer a very great service. And it's been wonderful 40 years working there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. Because I'm asking the questions, I get the first one, if that's all right. Of all the things that you've sold, what's the one you want to have in your house?
Well, curiously, I am very, very keen on the late Turner belonging to Kenneth Clark, one that we showed earlier on. There's something astonishing about the colour. It's a combination of a great artist like Turner looking forward, one might say, to the 20th century. It's got the best of all worlds. It's an old master and it's a contemporary painting. I think the endless different colours, the different the way the waves, go over each other. I think there would be endless interest to own that picture. But if you asked me tomorrow, I'd probably say something completely different.
I completely understand. Has anybody else got any other questions that they would like to ask? We have a roving mic.
When was the wine department started?
When was wine department?
The wine, yes, because that was quite a big...
Yes. Funny enough, the wine department was an area, I can't tell you when it started, but it was an area where, for a long time, Christie's, I think, were market leaders. And I think it was during my time that we beefed up the wine department and actually held really great sales of wine, including Lord Lloyd Webber's cellar, many other things. And that hasn't been outsourced. We were talking about all the areas that have been outsourced, like coins and stamps and medals. But the wine department is still very important, and very important in America too. But I can't tell you when the wine department was founded, when it started. But I think Christie's had an edge there to begin with.
It's still going on, though, isn't
Oh, yes, certainly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because Patrick Grubb was...
Patrick Grubb was indeed,
Yeah.
in my day, Patrick Grubb was the person who, I don't know whether he started it, but he certainly gave it an enormous boost.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right, yes, Patrick Grubb.
Thank you.
There was a lady at the front here. Oh, sorry.
Thank you, David, for a fascinating talk. I could have listened all night. I'm sure many of us have travelled around and been to various galleries in New York, Paris, Washington, and everywhere I go, I seem to see an awful lot of the same French impressionists. Are they all genuine, or are they copies? Or there seem to be an awful lot of them.
Well, there are a lot of fakes. I think it'd be true to say that it's probably easier to fake an impressionist painting than it is to fake, let us say, a major Rubens, like what we've shown there. The thing about impressionist painters is, because of the amount of money involved, every single great impressionist artist has an expert and a catalogue raisonné, and it's almost, you may have watched, for instance, the television program about a Monet that was appeared not far from here, and I knew the owner, you know the owner. And there was a lot of argument as to whether or not that was by Monet, but the Wildensteins run the catalogue raisonné, and they said no, and if they say no, that's it. And it's very difficult. But there was a bit of a scandal in the press because some very dodgy impressionists were produced for Dumfries House. You may have read it was all in the papers. And I was all surprised about that because I think that the Royal Collection of Prince Charles would have had access to a lot of experts, but they borrowed these pictures. I don't think they ever hung them, and they all turned out to be fakes. So you're quite right, there are fakes. But then, you know, there have been fakes. As I say, when I arrived at Sothebys, Tom Keating was faking all these Samuel Palmers. I'm afraid fakes, there will always be fakes. There were fakes if you go back, you know, to the Roman times. I mean, it is. The other thing about Impressionist paintings is, dare I say, and this is an awful thing because my area is British paintings, they can look rather the same. You know, one Monet of poppies in a field can look much like another Monet, poppies in a field, particularly as they used to repeat the same subject.
Excellent, thank you. There was a question from a young man at the back there.
What is the most expensive painting you've ever sold?
Well, whether this means as an auctioneer, I was an auctioneer, but I didn't take any of the major auctions. The most expensive picture that I've ever personally as an auctioneer sold was a rather wonderful Gainsborough that has now gone back to Chatsworth. But we're not talking more than just over £1 million. So I can't claim to have sold these multi-million pounds. I mean, the most expensive picture ever auctioned still remains the Leonardo da Vinci, which I think is, I wrote it down because I had a horrible feeling I'd be asked how much it would make. The Salvator Mundi, 450 million. That is the most expensive picture ever sold at auction and remains so. A lot of people argue as to how much of it is actually by Leonardo, and no one knows where it is. And when there was a big Leonardo exhibition, there was a great deal of argument as to whether it would be lent to that exhibition or not. And I think the owners said, we'll only lend it if it hung next to the Mona Lisa. Well, obviously they couldn't do that, so it's a curious thing. But that is a long way ahead. But coming up soon, I believe, is an Andy Warhol of Marilyn Monroe that's meant to make about $200 million. So it's very interesting to look at the most expensive pictures sold, because there are, in the top 20, there are only 2 old masters, one by Leonardo and a Botticelli that Sotheby sold in New York last year. The rest are either contemporary or post-impressionist.
Very interesting. Shall we take one more question? Oh, there are hands up from family at the back there. Yes. Come on.
Are the fakes worth money?
Are the fakes worth money?
Well, some of the fakes are worth some money. Some fakers are better than others. Tom Keating, who faked Samuel Palmer, some of his fakes were actually sold. There was a very famous painter called Van Meegeren who faked during the war, faked old masters. And he was actually an extremely good painter. He fooled Goering, who paid a lot of money, I think, for a Rubens. I can't remember, it may have been Rubens. So fakes can be. There is, I remember when I was at Sotheby's, there was a wonderful porcelain expert called Jim Kiddell, and he had a fake museum, a little fake museum. And in order to teach everybody about porcelain, which is area, he said the best way to learn is to look at a fake and then look at the real thing. So the best way to learn probably about paintings, particularly, let us say, Samuel Palmer, would look at a Keating and then look at the real thing. And then you wonder how he's able to fool people. Fakers are very clever at fooling people. It's not just what they paint, it's the provenance. Mr. Keating invented enormous provenance for all these Samuel Palmers, and they'd gone off to India, and that's why no one had seen them. And major dealers, and I'm sorry to say, on one occasion, Sothebys, sold these as genuine. So the fakes can be good.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much. Would everybody like to join me in saying thank you very, very much to David for a wonderful